If intelligence is partly genetic, and if you create a social system where intelligence is rewarded, aren't you necessarily punishing the least intelligent groups? And isn't this a form of systemic racism?
Well, that's one way of thinking about systemic racism. I mean, it certainly is.
Hello and welcome to A Theory of Everything. I'm Luis Razo, the director of ASEM and host of this channel. Today I'm talking to Professor Amy Wax, the Robert Mundheim Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. She has one of the most impressive academic and professional backgrounds of anybody you'll ever meet. She received a bachelor's degree in molecular biophysics, summa cum laude, from Yale University, after which she studied philosophy, physiology, and psychology as a Marshall Scholar at Oxford. She then got an MD with cum laude distinction from the Harvard Medical School, after which she went to Harvard Law School before getting her JD from Columbia University. In the interest of brevity, I will not list her many professional achievements and awards. Take my word for it. This lady is impressive and accomplished on many different levels. She has argued 15 cases before the US Supreme Court, and her most recent book is called Race, Wrongs, and Remedies, Group Justice in the 21st Century, published by Stanford's Hoover Institute. Knowing all of this about Professor Wax, you will probably not be surprised to learn, as I no longer am in these cases, that she is Jewish. There's something about the Jewish people, specifically the Ashkenazi, that allows them to simply dominate the things of the mind. That something is called intellectual capacity, which is part of what we're going to talk about today. Specifically, we're going to talk about race and intelligence and the connection between cognitive ability and group justice. This is an important topic that Professor Wax has paid a heavy price for broaching. In my view, she is one of the true heroes on the scene today, a person who's willing to have honest, difficult, and truthful conversations about profoundly important topics. I feel honored to have had this opportunity to talk to her. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that this is not just another opinionated podcast. Everything we're going to talk about parts from an understanding of physics that we set forth in our inaugural lecture. If you haven't watched that first lecture, I encourage you to do so. You'll find a link on the screen now. If you find any value in this exchange, stay tuned. Professor Wax has agreed to a second conversation where we'll talk about the plight of Western civilization and potential solutions. As always, you'll find a timestamp in the video description. Thanks for listening. Professor Wax, you are in Pennsylvania and I'm in Barcelona. Welcome to A Theory of Everything, and thanks so much for doing this.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, the pleasure is mine. I'd like to start with a question that I ask all of my guests. It's not a trick question, it's very straightforward, but I think it's an important question that helps contextualize any and every intellectual conversation. Do you agree or disagree that the worst thing that could possibly happen is for humans to go extinct tomorrow?
Well, that is a very deep philosophical question. I would answer that it's not the worst thing that could possibly happen, but it would certainly be, in my mind, a negative outcome, because I believe that human beings are represent on some level the pinnacle of biological creatures of development. I have a little bit of an old-fashioned notion about that. Maybe you could call it teleological. I'm not sure what label you would put on it. But I guess I believe that we have accomplished glorious things that are intrinsically valuable. We are capable of accomplishing those things on the artistic level, on a scientific level, on a social level. And it would be a shame for that to be wiped out. Also, I'm not saying this from a theological point of view because I'm not really a person of faith. But to me, suicide is a kind of desecration. It's a little bit like getting a tattoo, actually, or body piercings. It really takes something beautiful and sacred and valuable and glorious and mutilates it, or destroys it just for the purpose of destruction. So I am certainly interested in forestalling the suicide of the human species, just as I am very interested in preventing the suicide of the West or Western civilization, which to me represents the best, the brightest, the greatest outcome of the terminus of achievement for society as well. And I'm quite firm in that position. I guess I am a Western civ chauvinist, although I don't like the term chauvinist because it has a negative connotation.
Okay, well, excellent. Thank you for
Champion
sharing.
would be better. Champion.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Well, thank you for sharing that. Well, we're meeting in very strange times. The streets of the US are figuratively, and in some cases literally, burning. And there's more polarization in almost every sense of the word than we can remember, I think, in our lifetimes. And this is paradoxical because we're talking about 6 decades, or 6 or 7 decades, depending on where you put the clock, of some of the most sweeping and successful advances in civil rights and equality. And yet the streets are burning. So I want to talk about that. And on top of that, you've recently gotten into some controversial positions for saying things that are not only logical and commonsensical, but they're empirically and scientifically provable. So there's something clearly amiss in Denmark. And so I want to talk about root causes of this. I want to talk about Western civilization, and I want to talk about potential solutions. Those 3 things, if we can, in a short amount of time.
Yeah.
But I'd like to begin with one thought experiment. And the thought experiment goes like this. Imagine that we lived in a society where your well-being and the well-being of your family, your children, your ability to put them in the best schools, your ability to feed them, depended on your basketball skills. So if you were really, really good in basketball, you're going to do really, really well for your family and your children. If you're not good in basketball, if you happen to have been born under 5 feet tall, you're kind of awkward at dribbling, etc., then you're going to do very poorly or relatively poorly in this society. And furthermore, or no, let's say that that people say to you, don't worry, if you're not good, we have plenty of basketball camps. You can go even on the weekends and holidays to these basketball camps. And so this is a basketball skills-based society. My argument is that my argument actually is the argument of 2 very important thinkers, and I think in American history, which are Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray. They argue that the United States, and by extension, the rest of the world, is increasingly polarizing based on intellectual capacity. So my question is, if we translate this advantage for the intellectual capacity into a society where basketball skills are the primary driver and the primary adjudicator of economic and social well-being, in your opinion, is this a fair society?
Well, first of all, you're talking about a dilemma that's been much written about, and lately we just have a pouring out of books and articles about it, which is the dilemma of the meritocracy. And given our advanced technological, scientifically based, and organizationally complex society, the gauge of merit, or the touchstone, is cognitive ability, intellectual ability. So we really need smart people, and smart people are absolutely essential to delivering the goods, delivering the benefits that we all enjoy, the benefits of prosperity, but also of our legal system, of our commercial system, of our scientific advances, our technological prowess. I mean, it all comes down to depending on the top echelon for intelligence, and that is the dilemma that we now find ourselves in, because contrary to what some people say, and I disagree with them, we really can't do without these people, right? And so as a result, we assign to them these outsized rewards. Partly comes from just workings of the economic system, which rewards people who are relatively rare. Talent has always been relatively rare in every society, but also a lot of self-dealing and self-serving behavior on the part of the elites to ensure they're secure their position, which has always been the case, right? But what does that do? It means that we leave behind, quote unquote, the people who don't have, or relatively leave behind the people who may not be quite as talented or haven't developed those talents as well. We also have another phenomenon, there's a lot going on here, of elite overproduction, that we've educated a very large part of the population, but there isn't necessarily a lot of bang for the buck there, and we don't necessarily have places for them. So that, I would call that the dilemma of the meritocracy is definitely, I think, one of the things, the important things that's going on right now. I don't think it is the only thing that's going on right now. And I want to just sort of park the meritocracy problem to one side, because I do have thoughts about what we ought to be doing about it and what we're not doing about it. And I want to go to sort of a more immediate problem, which is related to it, which is the problem of race. Which this country really has never solved, never dealt with. It goes back to your conversation with Herrnstein. Whatever the source, nature, nurture, or both, the fact is that different groups in the United States, different racial and ethnic groups, have very different measured levels of cognitive ability on average. Of course, everyone represents a range. Every group has a range, right? That's the whole notion of the bell curve, the distribution. But ever since these numbers have been measured, we have seen that Blacks, for example, and they're sort of at the center of the moral drama here, have a cognitive ability measured IQ that is about 1 standard deviation below whites. And Asians have a slightly higher average measured IQ. Well known that Jews have, more than a 1 standard deviation average measured IQ, even than other whites. They average about 115 as opposed to 100. And what does that translate into? And once again, I'm not talking about causes here. I'm just talking about what people call race realism, the facts on the ground. What it translates into is, if you know anything about statistics, a stark and dramatic disproportion of very intelligent people, people with, let's say, IQs of 130 and above, who are the people who end up in the lucrative professions, in the highly rewarding positions, who are elevated to places where they are in charge, right? Because they have proven themselves to be especially capable. And this means, what is the bottom line here? The bottom line is that we do not have, as a factual matter, what they now call equity in our society, what has come to be called equity, which is proportional numbers of each group in every position. And that's true all through the distribution of the bell curve. But the area that we're most focused on, of course, are the people with the most power and influence, the people who earn the most money, who are the people at the top. And those people are disproportionately white. They're heavily Jewish relative to Jews in the population, who are only 2%. And more we are getting what is called in the literature an Asian overclass, because Asians also, do well on these sorts of tests. And in addition, they have this culture, that's true of a number of groups, that is heavily test-oriented, achievement-oriented, education-oriented. So that just sort of gets layered on top of the underlying measured differences, okay? Now, what's happening now? So we have the problem of individual differences, which is the meritocracy, regardless of class and race, and what to do about the fact that, some people end up on the top and other people end up in the middle or on the bottom for whatever reason. And then we have the fact that we also have group hierarchies, which aren't going away. The numbers are really not changing regardless of affirmative action. And I'm actually writing something about this now. The situation is pretty stagnant. So to me, the most immediate upset is a direct product of these facts about race, which have become increasingly embarrassing, I think, and upsetting to the powers that be, white liberals and lefties who are just look at the situation and see that it hasn't really changed despite their best efforts and pouring all sorts of resources and services and programs into the problem. Blacks who are mad because they are not getting what they consider to be their fair share of these top positions. And then it's complicated by the fact that we have this pouring in of immigrants from all sorts of backgrounds, and especially Asians, and they are sort of leapfrogging over both native-born blacks and to some extent the native-born white population, although the people at the top of the white population are still doing very well and are very important to our society's ingenuity and creativity. They're okay, right? So the question is, what do we do about it? Now, what the sort of woke culture is about, which is new on the scene, what Wesley Yang calls the successor ideology, there are all sorts of labels and names for it, is just kind of saying, we've tried very hard to advance underrepresented and underachieving minorities in this system. It hasn't worked. It's really frustrating. What could possibly be the explanation? Well, I'll tell you one explanation that is forbidden, okay? It's been under a cloud for a long time, and now it's absolutely taboo. Blacks on average just aren't as smart as whites. They're not as smart as Asians. They're not yet, and maybe never will be, sufficiently developed as a population to take their place in equal numbers in these most demanding leadership positions. They're not equipped to direct our society. This is a very blunt way of putting it, right? We can't say that. I mean, we can't say it not just, in terms of what's causing it. Is it nature, nurture? Do genes have anything to do with it? Which is really the third rail. We can't even state the facts anymore.
Yes, I think this is part of
of these companies that have pledged to, hire more underrepresented minorities like blacks. If you look at all of the woke, breastfeeding that's been going on society-wide, never is there any mention of these underlying facts. Indeed, they've completely omitted any concepts related to meritocracy, such as competence, excellence, qualifications, ability, skills, all that stuff has just vanished, right, from the discourse.
May I comment very quickly? I think
Sure.
you've touched on some very interesting and important topics. A couple of things that come to mind. First of all, I'd say we can come to this later, but first of all, just to get this in, this is necessarily a product of Western civilization on the one hand. But before this, however, I think you've summarized the essential problem I wanted to get across with the basketball thought experiment.
Right. Okay. So we go back to justice. Yeah.
Right. So if we're living in a city where basketball determines our well-being, isn't it justifiable, or isn't it understandable at least, that the least able basketball players will say, you know what, F the system, you've got it all wrong, I'm not going to participate, in fact, I'm going to burn your cities because this is a bunch of bullshit.
Right.
Isn't it understandable that the intellectual elite, what you've just described, I think it's exactly what's happening. And this is exactly what Herrnstein has been or predicted, for the last 50 years. It's exactly what's happening. The intellectual elite is taking over the most prominent positions in society and enacting policy and program that is beneficial to them. And this applies on both the left and the right, right? The left says, give me more money and I'll change the system for you. Meanwhile, they're making upwards of $200,000, $300,000, $500,000 a year. On the right is saying, no, just try hard enough. If you can't make it, it's because you're not trying hard enough. Just try hard enough. But the fact is that people and groups are different. And the fact that we can't talk about this, primarily because the intellectual elite is too effing selfish to look at the facts and look at the reality of the situation. This is why Marxist hatred across all social classes is now causing so much damage to the US. Yeah. Do you think this is wrong or this is not the case? How do you feel about that?
Well, this is complicated. It has a number of moving parts. First of all, just the left, the sweet ladies on the Upper West Side who go out to the Hamptons saying, just try hard enough. We're just going to get everybody into college and everybody's going to be upper class like us. I mean, is ludicrous, of course. Upward mobility is no solution to this because, as I said in a review about a year ago of a book about dream hoarders, one of the many books that is in this ilk, I said only 20% of the people can be in the top 20%. Let's just think about that. I mean, that's just arithmetic. Okay. I mean, not everybody can be part of the elite and not everybody can live by the elite. So we have to start from that understanding, as hard as it is to swallow. So what do we do about that? Well, you're right. There is a kind of fundamental injustice, and many people have noted it, that some people are born smart, other people not, or even that some people are born into families that cultivate, that provide the order and the security that enable to cultivate whatever talents they have. Now, John Rawls has a famous passage in Theory of Justice where he says, we really deserve nothing. It's turtles all the way down. Well, as a practical blueprint for society, you're never going to get people to really believe that in its entirety, because we do see that some people are virtuous, some people are not, some people prudent, some people not. We don't really believe that that's determined. It's very hard to run a society where you're waiting for determinism to happen. So I think there is only going to be a partial recognition that luck has something to do with where people turn out or how people turn out, and that we ought to take that into account in social policy. Now, how can we take that into account? Well, a way not to do it is to explode merit, just blow it up, right? Why? Why do I think that? Because we all benefit from it, right? We all benefit when the best and the brightest are put to tasks like developing a COVID vaccine, and they're better at it. And really and truly, these benefits do trickle down to society. Our society is all of its virtues and advantages, and there are many, many, right? And try doing without them. We need to be grateful for them. They are a disproportionate part, the product of ingenuity and smarts and even genius on the part of a very small number of people. So I would not implode seriously this idea that we need to temper the meritocracy with other principles and other centers of regard and respect for people who are willing to work, live virtuously, and contribute in a positive way to society. And I think that is really a critical statement, because I think we have fallen down in that respect. There are a lot of new books coming out about how do we restore dignity and respect to the average person. To me, the measure of a good society is one where the average person has a decent basic life, has basic needs met, and can hold their head up high. Now, why isn't that happening right now? Well, there are, a number of developments, I think, that explain it. One is that I'm going to go now and I'm going to blame the 60s, okay? And I think the problem with the sort of liberationist ethos of the 60s is that they deflected focus from the ordinary norms, the moral decencies that did constrain people, but also allowed ordinary people to live a regular, virtuous life by assigning them roles, by giving them a script for how to behave, by having strict rules about criminality, about industry, about working, supporting yourself, stigmatizing things like dependency, out of wedlock childbearing. In other words, all of these rules, which there has been a many decade effort to implode and weaken, the weakening of those rules, the discarding of those rules, has hurt average people and below average people far more than it has hurt upper middle class people. Now, I've written about this. Rob Henderson, who's a essayist and a psychologist, has written about this. Charles Murray has written about this. Chapter 22 of the Bell Curve, which is not often discussed, is a chapter that is devoted to what do we do about people who are intellectually undistinguished? How do we create a place for them in society? Well, of course, we have a whole economic side that we need to discuss of what kinds of jobs these people will have and what kinds of rewards. But there is a moral side that the elite intelligentsia, the left elites, just completely ignore. They have pulled the rug out from under these ordinary people in eroding the importance of religion, undermining religious institutions, undermining civic institutions, attacking nationalism, attacking civic pride and national pride and patriotism and all of the values and all of the ethos and ideals that give these people meaning and structure in their life. So I think that it is on the moral side, the norm side, that we really need to focus. Now, the problem is that our elites feel very uncomfortable talking about that stuff, right?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think you
they don't want to talk about it partly because they want the freedom to run their life as they see fit, and they have the acumen and the executive function and the ability to, and the kind of ability to postpone gratification and all of the organizational personal characteristics which go along with IQ and are not exactly the same as the origins of upper middle class people. Better ability to cope with life and make complex decisions is complicated. And
okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you've just set forth as far as I'm concerned, a very compelling argument for a type of systemic, if it's not racism, direct racism, it's indirect racism, in the sense that the people who are most going to suffer from this institutional configuration are the people with the lowest IQ, which if we,
yes.
if we go by...
Blacks suffer from it too, because not only, do they have measured lower IQ, for whatever reason, and they just do, but they also have a society that is weaker and more disorganized, across the board. So, much weaker families, very high out of wedlock birth rate, higher rates of criminality, lower academic achievement, father abandonment, which, as Moynihan said, and nothing has changed, is a situation that invites and gets chaos in the community for all sorts of ecological reasons. I mean, because when you have unattached men who are not constructively engaged in pro-social activities, they tend to gravitate towards anti-social activities, and that's what we have in the Black community. So we have now a situation where people in the kind of great average arena or below average are living these very disorganized lives, and in many ways destructive lives, and it is spilling over now to the rest of us. Well, I mean, in our cities, it has spilled over for a very long time. Now, the elites are willing to keep the lid on it because they had a fair amount of confidence in the touchstones of an orderly and civilized society, like you don't allow people to sleep and defecate on the street, simple stuff that they believed in. Now they've abandoned all those beliefs. They've basically thrown us to the wolves of complete disorder in the name of, I don't know, equity, inclusion, compassion, or whatever it is. Now, getting back to, we kind of oscillate between the individual meritocracy, the challenges to individuals of the fact that our society is a hierarchy and it always will be, okay, to the race problem. So getting back to the race problem, I think it is a tough sell to get Blacks to face up to their continuing deficits and accept the place assigned to them until they get their house in order.
I would
If
say,
they ever do. I mean, you're asking them to accept that they are not going to be well represented at Harvard. They're not going to be well represented in the higher echelons of medicine, in the higher echelons of finance, that, you know, they're not going to make it to that on the ordinary neutral principles of the meritocracy. And it takes a very mature culture and person to accept that. There are people in the Black community who are very mature and very sophisticated, like Glenn Lowry, who understand that, you know, there's a long way to go. But
I would, may I interrupt?
I want it now.
May I interrupt very quickly? I think you hit some very important points. I think, for example, Glenn Lowry has been, as far as I can tell, reluctant to accept the idea that Blacks are naturally disadvantaged intellectually. And some of the other...
That's a bridge further than saying as a factual matter right now they are. My understanding, and I haven't discussed it with him directly, is that he does not think there is any kind of genetic or innate basis to the differences. You know, here we really need to make an important distinction, which is always conflated. You know, the first is, do Blacks have measured lower cognitive ability than whites on average, given the instruments that we have developed for measuring that? You know, and part of that question is, are those instruments reliable? Do they predict? Are they useful? Or is it all just an illusion and bogus? Those are sort of technical questions of measurement and prediction. Okay.
Well, we know the answer to that already, is that if we have to throw out intelligence, we have to throw out everything else in psychology,
right.
because it's
solidest. That is the most solid result in you know, cognitive science, in empirical social science. Steven Pinker has made that clear. He says, you know, there's a lot of really bad, unreliable social science out there, but the science of IQ is the best we've got, which is true, right? But that is a very different question, and I think a really much easier one, although equally taboo, or maybe not equally, but pretty taboo in the current climate, to what is the cause of that? I mean, that is a really complicated question, because it involves, you know, tracing and illuminating and understanding the genetic origins of behavior, and of course, you know, ability, or the wellsprings of behavior, of performance. That, you know, I think is far from settled. Now, as I told Glenn Lowry, based on the science as it is in its fairly nascent form, although it's developing rapidly, of how do we separate nature and nurture as an influence on something like cognitive ability or personality, or, you know, any attribute of a human being that you might choose, that, you know, that science is very sophisticated. It's very hard to interpret, but given what I've seen of it so far, and given what we know about evolution and adaptation and a lot of different topics that feed into this, if I had to place a high stakes bet, as I told Glenn Lowry, I would bet that there is a genetic component to group differences in cognitive ability. But do I know it for certainty? Of course not. I don't know it for certainty. A lot of the evidence points in that direction, right?
Well, one thing I think is clear, it's obviously still an open question.
Yes,
however,
absolutely.
The vast majority of experts agree that there is a strong genetic component at this time. Can it be?
Well, I saw that survey, a substantial number of experts. I mean, the survey I saw was like half or somewhat more than half, a majority of experts think there is some genetic component, but there is
something I'd like to shed light on this, because I don't think that question is ultimately the most important, even though it's clear. I've never heard anybody argue, any serious academic argue that it's possible for one day to understand that it's 100% environmental. You know, people aren't born male or female because of the environment.
Well, right? Gender is different from intelligence. I mean, you know, that's a completely different parameter. You know, if you want to get into the gender thing, I mean, I think the genders are the same. There's no distinction. It's equivalent to saying that, you know, being a flat earther. I mean, that's just a non-starter. It's nonsense.
Yeah.
So we can put aside the gender, question as far as I'm concerned, because
No, but even when it comes to race, however, even if we could, another thought experiment, engineer the absolute perfect environment for everybody, so that every single individual has the best teacher, the best schools, the best nutrition, the best parents, the best environment, so that in this perfect world that we've engineered in our minds, science tells us, fundamental physics tells us that we would not create equality. We would actually create more inequality. And I think this is an important point that most people don't understand this. They think that you can engineer equality. And this gets us to another important topic. We've covered so many interesting things here. However, I want to respect your time, and hopefully you'll come back again at some point in the future so we can talk about Western civilization and what can be done about this. Because as far as I'm concerned, this goes to the heart of Western civilization, and a very, very critical bifurcation of that civilization between the Anglo branch of it that went off on its own in the 1600s or so, and another branch that is older and takes root more in the southern part of Europe and goes back to ancient Israel. So I hope we can take that up in the future at some point.
Well, going back to the relationship of nature and nurture, genes and environment, you're absolutely right. And this, I've seen this talked about now a bit by more hard-headed people, even on the left, that if you enrich the environment and equalize the environment, make it equal and equally, generous and plush, paradoxically, the influence of environment drops out, and the existing and observed variation is due to underlying genetic difference. So upper middle class homes, for example, in white America, I have 3 kids, and I like to think I gave them all the same environment. And it was, a great environment, although I'm sure you could come in and fault my parenting style in all sorts of ways. That's always possible, but good enough. My kids are wildly different in their personality, in their interests, even in their, intellectual ability. I mean, they're not wildly different, but there is a range there. Absolutely. And, that is a common observation within families, so you're controlling for family environment, and you're going to see a lot of individual variation. It's quite an interesting phenomenon. Now, what about groups, right? So Blacks, although it's a very troubled population in some ways, they still have enjoyed rising affluence, rising better economic conditions. They are experiencing a more enriched environment. Doesn't matter. There's a whole army of experts that are dedicated to trying to show, right, that the genetic origins of individual differences in personality, intelligence, cognitive ability, and all of the predicates for performance and achievement in our society, that those don't translate into the differences between groups. There's a totally different dynamic at work. And what it boils down to, now I'm thinking about Eric Turkheimer here, who's sort of the champion of this view. What it boils down to, and his acolytes, is Blacks in the United States are so deprived, their environment is so bad that it suppresses their natural variation in IQ and cognitive excellence. And, because it's less and less plausible that they're actually experiencing material deprivation, they've had to segue into this kind of metaphysical, structural, systemic racism shtick, where they say, well, we may not be able to point to anything specific, even parenting, even environment, because we now have a substantial middle class of Blacks. We have even, not very many, 2-parent families earning a fairly substantial income, and they still score lower.
So there is this trope of sorts on the right that systemic racism does not exist. And obviously, racism is much less of a factor today than it ever has been in the past. However, what we've been talking about today is a type of systemic racism, because if you create a society where intelligence is especially rewarded, then what you're doing is punishing the least intelligent, right?
Well,
So
that's one way of thinking about systemic racism. I mean, it certainly is. And I think the honest people will say, people like Ibram Kendi, who's no fool. I mean, if you read his book, it's kind of clever. He's basically saying, yeah, the meritocracy, the system and the society that whites, quote unquote, I mean, although not exclusively whites, of course, but predominantly, the Anglo culture, predominantly Anglo culture, with admixture of other Europeans, has created, which is meritocratic, which is technologically intensive, which is individualistic. I don't know if you know this new book called Weird People by this guy Heinrich, who describes very well this Western society. He's a Harvard anthropologist.
I'll take a look at it. Yeah, I don't know it.
That society, from top to bottom, in its essence, everything about it is, intrinsically racist, because blacks do worse. And they never talk about, the theories of why blacks do worse. They basically, Kendi says, blacks do worse, and blacks are not inferior in any way, or I don't like the word inferior, they're not underdeveloped in any way, they're not different in any way. They should be equal in every respect. And if you have a society in which they're not equal in every respect, you have a racist society and you have to get rid of it. QED. That's his basic position. Okay. And there is a kind of coherence to that. I mean, it is a racist society in the sense that groups
are different, in the sense that groups are different. No, I think
that for now, that groups are different. And for now, some groups will end up, more on top than others because the society calls upon particular or different attributes, traits, strengths, and some groups have more of them. Some groups have more of them. And the fact is, once again, I'm speaking very starkly. Whites have more of them than blacks right now.
Yes.
So, what do we do about that? And what he wants to do about that is say, well, we're racist, and therefore we have to just turn it all upside down. We have
one thing seems clear to me. I think that we're talking about something that is, from a broad evolutionary perspective, in the broadest anthropological sense, and in terms of Western civilization, I think we're talking about things that are much more dangerous and important for our survival as a species than whether or not somebody is treated unfairly in a city. I think what we're talking about is an increasing polarization that nobody really knows how to deal with, because very soon, this increasing polarization between the most intelligent and the least intelligent, especially at the extremes of the bell curve, very soon, in fact, it's already started, the intelligentsia and the most ambitious and driven people are going to start to genetically engineer themselves and their children. And it's reasonable to assume that they're not going to engineer themselves or their children to close the intellectual gaps. And I think this is the recipe for, in a world filled with nuclear bombs, I think this spells a really dangerous situation. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is part of the predicament that Western civilization has created for itself.
Yes, well, first of all, I think we're kind of getting a little ahead of ourselves when we talk about genetic engineering. I think we are engaging in a kind of behavioral genetic engineering, which is called assortative mating.
Exactly.
And of course, as Charles Murray has amply documented, and I have to give him a huge amount of credit because he called this trend before anyone else did, because no one else wanted to see it. We've effected this kind of separation between the classes that is geographic, that is educational, that is cultural, that, across every parameter in terms of taste, in terms of behavior, in terms of politics and outlook and attitudes. I mean, it's enormous, this coming apart, which is a great phrase. But you see, we could have avoided that. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote a wonderful book. I think it was back in the 70s or early 70s. I'm not sure quite of the date, called The Disuniting of America. He was kind of one of the last real elite WASP liberals. And he said, we no longer have, and our ruling class is no longer promoting a common culture, a common set of beliefs, of norms, of mores, of goals, of understandings. They have dropped the ball on that. They have lost confidence. They no longer believe that they have the authority or the right to do it, and they maybe no longer believe in the fundamental precepts. They have created this free-for-all. Once again, this has come out of the 60s. And as a result, a lot of bad ideas have made their way into society, bad ideas which, the upper middle class has peddled, although in their day-to-day life, they can overcome them. They talk the 60s, they live the 50s, which is a really strange phenomenon. But the lower classes who are, full of resentment anyway, because they've gotten the short end, they've taken these ideas and they've taken them to really destructive extremes in their behavior mainly. I mean, they're not, not necessarily idea people. So we have this divergence that is due to a kind of drift, a moral drift. I think it is a moral drift. I mean, frankly, I think the role of the sexual revolution is wildly underestimated. It has been really destructive and disastrous when added to our, individualism, our underlying individualism, which is a force that has been for good as well as ill and needs to be kept within bounds, right? We are no longer keeping a lot of these tendencies in our society within bounds. To quote Lord Patrick Devlin, one of the great British conservative jurists in the 19th century, the key is to keep these dysfunctional, potentially dysfunctional behaviors and principles within bounds. And they've just spun wildly out of control, and it has created these divides. So now we're kind of stuck with a very bad situation.
Very good, very good. I'd like to, I know you have a commitment today. I'd like to pause here and thank you so much. We've covered so many interesting topics. I'd like to thank you for your time and your very courageous decision to speak up and to take the brunt of this. I think it's a really, really important conversation. And at the moment, I think we'll both agree that the United States, and by extension, the rest of the world, is kind of lost. It's lost, and these are really important conversations. Professor Wax, I appreciate very much your time, and I wish you the best in everything.
Well, thank you for having me on.